Story number 1. I never used to believe in ghosts. It's easy to be skeptical when you've never experienced anything truly unexplainable, when all the strange sounds can be written off as old pipes or settling foundations. That changed during my stay at the Hotel St. Francis in Santa Fe. The hotel was old, its adobe walls thick with history. Our room was modest but charming, and among the vintage furniture was an antique wooden chair with an oddly slanted seat. I noticed the slant immediately because I needed somewhere to put my laptop bag. The backward tilt made it perfect. My bag would rest securely against the chair's high back, with no risk of falling forward. I hung my new dress on the back of the chair as well. At check-in, I'd noticed how the front desk clerk's eyes lingered on our room number when he handed us the key, but I didn't think much of it at the time. The room itself was comfortable enough, though something about it felt different from other hotel rooms I'd stayed in. Not bad different, just a sense that the space wasn't quite ours. We spent the day exploring Santa Fe's historic plaza, browsing art galleries and sampling local food. Before leaving, we'd put the "Do Not Disturb" sign on our door. I'm always particular about my belongings when traveling. When we returned that evening, my dress lay crumpled on the floor beside the chair. I frowned, wondering if housekeeping had ignored our sign, though nothing else in the room appeared touched. Even the bed was still unmade, exactly as we'd left it. My husband suggested the dress might have slipped off, but I'd hung it securely. Plus, the way it lay on the floor looked more like it had been tossed aside than fallen. Still, I tried not to let my imagination run wild. We ordered room service and settled in for the night, tired from walking the city's hills all day. As we lay in bed talking about our plans for tomorrow, the room felt unusually cold. The heating was on, but there was this persistent chill that seemed to hover around the corner where the chair stood. My husband didn't notice it. He was halfway to sleep already, but I kept glancing at that corner, unable to shake the feeling that something was off. Around midnight, we were jolted awake by a deafening slam. My husband reached for the lamp, and in the sudden light, I saw my laptop bag lying on the floor. Not beside the chair, but across the room, a good 15 feet away. The sound had been so violent, it left my ears ringing. We both stared at the bag in silence. The physics made no sense. Even if it had somehow slipped off the backward slanted seat, it couldn't have traveled that far on its own. The chair was positioned facing the wall. For the bag to have landed where it did, someone would have had to throw it. "Guess this place is haunted like a lot of places in Santa Fe," my husband said with a shrug that felt absurdly casual. "Maybe the ghost doesn't like stuff on his chair." He tried to make it sound like a joke, but his voice had an edge to it. I insisted we leave the light on for the rest of the night. The laptop bag lay where it had landed. I couldn't bring myself to check if my computer had survived until morning. Every time I looked at the chair, it seemed different now. Less like furniture and more like something that belonged to someone else. Sleep was impossible. The room had grown so cold we could see our breath, though the heating was still running. Around 5 in the morning, we heard footsteps in the hallway. Light, quick steps, like someone running past our door. But when my husband checked, the hallway was empty. At breakfast, he asked the front desk clerk if the hotel was known to be haunted. The young man's response made my stomach turn. He laughed and said, "Oh, what did you see? The little girl?" He wouldn't elaborate further, just smiled knowingly and went back to his work. We changed rooms for our second night, requesting something on a different floor. The new room was fine, warm, normal, unremarkable. But sometimes I still think about that chair and how certain spaces seem to remember their original owners, no matter how many years have passed. My laptop survived its supernatural encounter, protected by its case, but I never did look at hotel furniture quite the same way again. Story number 2. I never believed in supernatural stuff. Growing up, I'd roll my eyes at ghost stories and change the channel whenever one of those paranormal investigation shows came on. But something happened during my junior year of high school that I still can't explain, even years later. My parents both worked at the local hospital, often on different shifts, which meant I spent a lot of nights home alone with our German Shepherd, Max. It was just another Tuesday evening in October when my dad left for his afternoon shift around 3 p.m. My mom was heading out for her night shift at 10. I was in the living room watching TV while my mom got ready to leave. Max had gathered his favorite spot near the stairs, a pile of my t-shirts he dragged there to lie on. Mom noticed them as she was putting on her coat. "Make sure those go in the hamper before bed," she said, gesturing to the shirts. "Got it," I replied, getting up to deal with them. The laundry hamper was in my parents' bedroom upstairs, but I was feeling lazy. I just gathered up the shirts and tossed them up to the second-floor hallway, figuring I'd grab them when I went up to bed. Mom was by the front door now, giving Max his goodbye pets. I waved as she headed out, then locked up behind her. The house felt different at night. Not scary, just emptier. I called Max to follow me upstairs, ready to get ready for bed. That's when things started getting weird. The shirts weren't in the hallway where I'd thrown them. I checked my bedroom first, thinking maybe they'd landed in there somehow, but no sign of them. Max followed close behind as I walked down the hall toward my parents' room. The shirts were there, sitting in a neat pile in the middle of their bedroom floor. I stopped in the doorway, trying to make sense of it. The layout of our house made it impossible for my throw to reach that far. Their bedroom was around a corner from the stairs, and the shirts had landed perpendicular to the direction I'd thrown them. I hadn't gone upstairs between throwing them, and now, Max hadn't left my side. There was no way for them to have moved there on their own. A chill ran down my spine as I walked over to pick up the pile. That's when I noticed something else that made my skin crawl. Under where the shirts had been sitting was a perfect circular burn mark in the carpet, about the size of a quarter. The carpet was melted and compressed, like something extremely hot had been placed there. I'd been in this room hundreds of times putting away laundry. That burn mark had never been there before. I knelt down to examine it closer. The edges were clean, not ragged, and there was no smoke or burning smell. It looked old, like it had been there for years, but I knew it hadn't been. I quickly tossed the shirts in the hamper and got out of there. Max wouldn't enter the room. He just stood in the doorway watching me, which was unusual for him. He always followed me everywhere. Back in my room, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe I'd thrown the shirts harder than I thought. Maybe I just hadn't noticed the burn mark before. But I knew I was lying to myself. The shirt's movement defied physics, and that burn mark had appeared out of nowhere. I lay in bed with Max pressed against my side, both of us awake and alert. The house creaked and settled like normal, but every sound made me tense up. I kept expecting something else to happen, but nothing did. When my dad got home at midnight, I was still wide awake. I didn't tell him what happened. I knew how it would sound. Even now, I have trouble explaining it to people without sounding crazy. I checked the next morning, and the burn mark was still there. It's still there today, though my parents have since moved out. I never saw anything else unexplainable in that house, but sometimes when I visit my old neighborhood, I find myself looking up at my parents' old bedroom window, wondering what really happened that night. Story number 3. I've never been the type to believe in supernatural stuff. Growing up in California, my biggest fears were earthquakes and wildfires, real, tangible threats. So when my best friend Kai invited me to spend the summer before senior year at his grandparents' house in rural Japan, I was more concerned about the language barrier than any cultural superstitions. The house was traditional, probably built in the 1960s, with sliding paper doors and tatami mat floors that creak satisfyingly under your feet. They put me up in what used to be Kai's mom's old room. It was simple enough: a futon, a desk, and a wall closet for storing bedding. What caught my attention was a smaller door mounted above the main closet, maybe 1.5 feet tall and 3 feet wide. When I asked Kai about it, he just shrugged and said it was probably for seasonal storage, though he'd never seen anyone use it. The first 2 weeks were brutal with jet lag. Japanese summers are suffocatingly hot and humid, so I spent most nights unable to sleep, watching anime on my laptop until dawn. During those sleepless nights, I started noticing something odd about that upper door. In the darkness, it seemed to absorb what little light there was in the room. While I could make out the regular closet below it and even the desk across the room, that small door remained a perfect rectangle of black. I wrote it off as my tired mind playing tricks on me. Until one morning, I woke up to find the small door wide open. I distinctly remembered it being closed the night before. I'd even pushed on it to make sure it was latched properly. The opening was completely dark despite morning sunlight flooding the room. I grabbed a chair and closed it firmly, checking twice that the old metal latch had caught. A few nights later, I finally started adjusting to the time difference and managed to fall asleep at a reasonable hour. I woke up around 3 a.m. feeling wrong. The room was dim but not pitch black, thanks to the streetlight outside. The small door was open again. That's when I noticed the darkness spilling from it was different. It wasn't just the absence of light. It seemed to have depth, like looking into a well at midnight. The darkness seemed denser than the rest of the room's shadows, almost as if it was slowly seeping out of the opening. The longer I stared, the more it seemed to move, like black smoke, but thicker, more deliberate. I tried to move, to sit up, to call out for Kai in the next room, but my body wouldn't respond. I'd heard about sleep paralysis before, but this felt different. I wasn't paralyzed by fear, though I was definitely afraid. It felt more like something was gently but firmly holding me in place. The air grew heavy, pressing down on my chest, making each breath shallow and difficult. The darkness from the door seemed to pulse slightly, like it was breathing. I lay there, unable to move, watching as the blackness appeared to thicken and spread across the ceiling. Time became impossible to track. It could have been minutes or hours before I felt a slight pressure on my forehead, like someone gently pressing their palm against it. The touch was cool but not cold, almost comforting in a strange way. Then the pressure slowly moved down to my eyes, and I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through the window. The door was firmly closed. Over breakfast, I casually mentioned to Kai that his mom's old room was kind of creepy at night. He got this weird look on his face and asked if anything specific had happened. I told him about the door opening and the strange darkness. He was quiet for a moment before telling me his mom had mentioned similar experiences when she was young, particularly about the feeling of being touched on the forehead. The rest of my stay passed without incident, though the door opened 2 more times. Each time I felt that same gentle pressure on my forehead, followed by immediate sleep. I never felt threatened, exactly, but there was always this sense that something was watching, waiting. On our last day, as we were packing up to head back to California, Kai's mom called to check in. When Kai mentioned I'd been staying in her old room, she laughed and said something in Japanese that made Kai grin. "What did she say?" I asked, already guessing. "She says she's glad you met the house ghost," Kai translated, still grinning. "She was worried it might have moved out after all these years." He paused, then added, "She says it used to help her sleep too, whenever she was stressed about school." I still don't believe in ghosts, but sometimes on sleepless nights back home, I find myself missing that small door and its strange darkness. More specifically, I miss that cool, gentle pressure on my forehead and the peaceful sleep that always followed. Story number 4. Growing up, my dad's armchair was his sanctuary. Every evening after work, you'd find him there watching TV or reading the paper. It was such a constant in our lives that the chair felt wrong when it was empty. But in 2002, that chair sat vacant for weeks while Dad was in the neurological ward at St. Mary's Hospital, 40 miles away, fighting a severe brain tumor. The doctors had warned us it was serious. Dad was barely conscious most days, the combination of medication and his condition keeping him under. I visited when I could, but between work and the distance, it wasn't as often as I wanted. Most evenings I'd get updates from my mom, who practically lived at the hospital, and try to distract myself at home. One Tuesday night around 10 p.m., I was chatting with my friend Mike on MSN Messenger. The blue chat window's glow was the only light in the room besides my computer screen. Mike knew about Dad's situation and asked how he was doing. Just as I read his message, I felt a presence to my left. I turned and saw Dad sitting in his armchair, just looking at me. He wasn't doing anything, just sitting there in his normal position, hands resting on the arms of the chair, wearing the blue sweater he always favored. The sight was so normal, so everyday, that I started typing, "Think he's okay," sat in the room with me, before my brain caught up with reality. Mike's response came quickly. "Isn't he in hospital?" That's when the strangeness of the moment hit me. I turned back to the chair, but it was empty. There was no gradual fading or movement. The chair was simply vacant, as it had been for weeks. The room felt suddenly colder, though not in an unpleasant way. more like the lingering feeling after a loved one's hug. I quickly typed back that I must have been seeing things, making a joke about needing sleep. But I knew what I'd seen. It hadn't felt like a hallucination or a trick of shadow and light. Dad had been there, as solid and real as the chair itself, if only for a moment. I didn't tell anyone else about it. How could I? Even my mom, worn down from hospital visits and worry, didn't need to hear about her son having visions. Dad pulled through, defying the doctor's more pessimistic predictions. The tumor was successfully treated, and while recovery took months, he eventually came home. Life gradually returned to normal, with Dad back in his chair every evening. Neither of us mentioned that night, me because I'd convinced myself it was stress-induced imagination, and Dad, well, I assumed he'd been unconscious in the hospital. 21 years passed. My parents had moved to a smaller place after retirement, the old armchair finally retiring too. I was visiting them one Sunday afternoon in 2023, having coffee in their kitchen while Mom was out at her gardening club. Dad had been quieter than usual, seeming lost in thought. "Something's been on my mind for years, son," he said suddenly, setting down his coffee. "When I was in the hospital with the tumor, I had this, well, I don't know what to call it. I remember being at our old house sitting in my chair. You were at your computer and you turned and looked right at me. The coffee mug nearly slipped from my hand." "Then what happened?" I managed to ask. "Then I woke up in the hospital," he continued, staring into his cup. "The nurses said I hadn't moved all night, but it felt too real to be a dream. I could see every detail. The light from your computer screen, that awful MSN Messenger color scheme you used, even the way your chair squeaked when you turned around. Been driving me mad for years, wondering if it really happened." I told him then about my side of that night. As I described typing to Mike, seeing Dad in the chair, each detail matched perfectly, right down to the blue sweater he remembered wearing in his experience. We sat in silence for a while after I finished, not awkward, but contemplative. Mom came home later to find us still in the kitchen, swapping old stories and laughing. We never did figure out exactly what happened that night. Dad jokes that his consciousness needed a break from hospital food and decided to pop home for a visit. Maybe he's right. Story number 5. My father's house always had its quirks. It was one of those older suburban homes, built in the 70s with creaky floorboards and the kind of character that realtors politely call lived in. My stepsister Jenny and I shared the upstairs bedrooms during our weekend visits, with a bathroom between our rooms that would later become the source of experiences I still can't explain. The first incident happened early one Saturday morning. I was half awake in my room when I heard footsteps overhead, the distinct sound of someone walking across my stepsister's bedroom floor. At first I assumed Jenny was up early, maybe getting ready for her weekend soccer practice. Then I heard my dad in the hallway bathroom, running water for his morning shave. The footsteps continued, heavy and deliberate. I got up to ask Jenny what she was doing so early, only to find my dad standing motionless at her closed door. He turned to me, his face still dotted with shaving cream, and whispered, "You can hear that too, right?" I nodded, both relieved and unsettled that I wasn't imagining things. The footsteps crossed the room again, clear as day, like someone pacing back and forth. Dad slowly opened Jenny's door. She was sound asleep in her bed, breathing deeply and regularly. There was no way she could have crossed the room, jumped into bed, and achieved that level of peaceful sleep in the 2 seconds it took Dad to open the door. More importantly, the footsteps had continued even as we stood there watching her sleep. Dad went into full investigation mode. He checked her old TV, one of those massive 90s models that would get noticeably warm when used. It was cold to the touch. The radio was off, ruling out the possibility that we were hearing the beat of some song. The windows were locked from the inside. Everything was exactly as it should be, except for those footsteps we'd both heard clear as day. That was just the beginning. The footsteps became a regular occurrence, usually in the early hours of the morning. Sometimes they were light, barely noticeable. Other times they were so heavy they would shake the ceiling fan in the dining room directly below Jenny's bedroom. We could track the movement across the ceiling, watching the fan tremble as the unseen footsteps passed overhead. Jenny started mentioning being woken up by the noise. She'd sit up in bed, completely alone in her room, listening to someone apparently walking around her. Sometimes she'd hear them while she was awake, studying at her desk or reading in bed. We all experienced it so many times that it became an unspoken normal part of life in the house, at least during those early morning hours. But the footsteps weren't the only thing. The upstairs bathroom had its own peculiarity, one I initially kept to myself. Every time I showered there, I felt like someone was standing right behind me. It wasn't just the usual paranoia you might get when you're alone with your eyes closed. This feeling was specific and consistent, a presence that seemed to occupy a precise spot just behind my left shoulder. The sensation became so intense that I started making excuses to shower at my mom's house instead. I'd time my showers before coming over for the weekend, or wait until I got home. If I had to use that bathroom at all, I'd leave the door wide open and try to be as quick as possible. I never told anyone about this. It seemed too strange, too personal somehow. Months passed this way until one ordinary afternoon when Dad caught me getting ready to leave early, as usual. He hesitated for a moment, then asked, "Do you ever feel like someone's in the shower with you when you're here?" The question stopped me cold. All those months of keeping that sensation to myself, of feeling crazy for being so unsettled by something I couldn't even see or explain. And here was my practical, level-headed father describing exactly what I'd been experiencing. We compared notes that day. The presence he felt was in the same spot, just behind the left shoulder. The same unshakable certainty that someone was standing there, watching. We even shared the same instinct to keep the bathroom door open, as if having an escape route somehow made it less intense. The footsteps and the shower presence continued for years. We never figured out what caused either phenomenon. The house had no dramatic history that we knew of, no deaths or tragedies that might explain such things. Eventually, we all developed our own ways of dealing with it. Jenny learned to sleep through the footsteps. Dad started using the downstairs bathroom for his shaves. I never did get comfortable showering there again. Story number 6, I was 12 when we moved into that apartment. It wasn't anything special, just a temporary place Mom found after the divorce while she looked for something more permanent. From the first night, though, something felt off about my bedroom. You know that feeling when someone's staring at you? It was like that, but constant. At first, I blamed it on being in a new place. New creaks, new shadows, new neighbors' noises to get used to. But then I started waking up at exactly 3 a.m. every night. Not 2:59, not 3:01, exactly 3:00. The red numbers on my alarm clock became something I dreaded seeing. I'd try to fight it, to keep my eyes shut, but every night, without fail, they'd snap open at that precise moment. One night in late October, about 6 weeks after we'd moved in, I woke up at the usual time. The apartment was silent except for the hum of the heating system. Then I heard it, a woman's voice calling my name. It wasn't my mom's voice. It wasn't anyone's voice I recognized. It was soft but clear, like someone trying to get my attention without wanting to startle me. I lay there frozen, hoping I was dreaming, but the voice called again. This time it was closer, as if someone had taken a few steps into my room. I could hear footsteps now, slow and deliberate, moving toward my bed. The voice kept calling my name, getting closer with each step. The weird thing was, even though I could hear the footsteps on the carpet and the voice was crystal clear, I couldn't see anyone. My room wasn't completely dark. The streetlight outside my window gave enough light to see by, but there was nobody there. Just the sound of steps and that voice, getting closer and closer. Something in me snapped. I launched myself out of bed and bolted for my brother Mike's room. He had this old bunk bed, and I practically flew up the ladder to the top bunk, not even bothering to be quiet. Mike was passed out on the bottom bunk. That kid could sleep through an earthquake. I kept shaking him, whispering his name urgently, but he just mumbled and rolled over. Then I heard it again, the footsteps, following me down the hallway. They stopped right at Mike's doorway. The voice called my name one more time, then everything went quiet. I spent the rest of the night wide awake on that top bunk, staring at the doorway, afraid to even blink. After that night, I gave up trying to sleep in my own room. Every night, I'd wake up at exactly 3 a.m. Sometimes I'd hear the voice immediately. Other times it would take a few minutes, but it always came. I got into a routine: wake up, wait for the first call of my name, then quietly slip out of bed and head straight to Mike's room. It got to the point where I started sleeping with my shoes on, ready to run. The voice seemed to get more insistent each night, the footsteps quicker, like whatever it was had begun anticipating my escape. The distance between my bed and Mike's room felt longer every time. I tried telling Mom about it once, about the voice and the footsteps. She just smiled that tired single mom smile and said I was probably having nightmares from watching too many horror movies. I stopped bringing it up after that, but I never stopped hearing that voice, never stopped feeling those eyes on me whenever I was in my room. The day we moved out, 3 months later, I made sure everything was packed from my room well before nightfall. Mom thought I was just being helpful, but I wasn't taking any chances. That last night, we slept on sleeping bags in the living room, since the beds were already in the moving truck. Still, at exactly 3 a.m., I woke up. The voice called from the direction of my old room, but for the first time it didn't come closer. The footsteps paced back and forth in there until sunrise, like something trapped in a cage. Mike still sleeps like the dead. Every time I crash at his place and hear him snoring through anything and everything, I think about those nights on his top bunk, listening to footsteps that shouldn't have been there while he slept peacefully below, completely unaware of our unseen visitor. Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.